Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Phil Ponce. On this Tuesday, May 15th.
We are committed to peacefully marching, and we're going to be focusing on the violence of NATO.
The city of Chicago has approved a permit for what's thought to be the largest anti-NATO rally. It's being held by the group CAIR. Usher Qureshi has the latest. 10 years into the war in Afghanistan, NATO is strapped for cash and still has 100,000 troops left in the country. After this, will the alliance ever again attempt a change in regime? We look at where NATO's been and where it's going.
Almost everyone, to a person I've talked to, said, we're getting the hell out of town. We're not going to be anywhere near here.
The city may be saying that it's business as usual during the NATO summit, but that's not what some downtown businesses are expecting. Why the gathering of world leaders is already causing a revenue drop in the loop. As the city braces for protests that will accompany the NATO summit this coming weekend, activists are already beginning to march. The largest planned rally that is expected to draw thousands on Sunday finally got its city permit approved today. Usher Qureshi reports.
With the NATO summit just days away, activists are taking to the streets in demonstration. This morning, protesters marched to the Chicago Immigration Court to spotlight U.S. immigration policies. Organized by Occupy Chicago and Our Lady of Guadalupe Anglican Mission, today's march was closely monitored by Chicago police officers as they made their way to the court. It was one of a number of smaller demonstrations that are popping up around the city leading up to the two-day summit this weekend. According to the city, only 3 parade permits have been issued to organizations planning to protest during the NATO summit: National Nurses United, Iraq Veterans Against the War, and the largest planned rally by the Coalition Against NATO G8 War and Poverty Agenda, or CAIR.
We are committed to nonviolence, to creating an atmosphere of healing America rather than of violence. And we have all of the folks getting on buses from around the country are signing personal nonviolent pledges on their way into Chicago because we believe another world is possible.
CAIR organizers have been battling the city on held-up permits for nearly a year, but today announced that they have been given approval to hold a 45-minute rally at the end of their permitted march on Sunday.
We have a permit in our time, and we are committed to peacefully marching, and we're going to be focusing on the violence of NATO, a violence which far surpasses any violence in any protest that this country has ever seen. It's about time that we stop being so narcissistic in this country and start focusing on the biggest violence that the world is seeing today, the wars that are being perpetrated by NATO.
According to city documents, the CAIR march will assemble at 9 a.m. Sunday at Butler Field. Starting at 2 p.m., they will proceed southbound on Michigan Avenue to Cermak Road, where organizers say they will have a stage and speakers set up for the end of their rally. Then, of course, there are the organizations and individuals that plan demonstrations and activities without city permits. Clown Block is an organization of protesters that will dress like clowns and take to the streets armed with pies. They plan to hold clown training here at Wellington United Church of Christ on Thursday and are accepting whipped cream donations and pies for use by the clowns in their protests. For dealing with those without permits, the city said in a statement, "We respect the First Amendment rights of protesters and try to accommodate First Amendment demonstrations. The course of action the city would take depends on a number of different factors, including the number of people involved, the extent to which they are impeding the public way, and the impact of the activity on the safety and welfare of the general public." But the arrests have already begun. On Monday, police arrested 8 protesters at President Obama's re-election campaign office in the Prudential Plaza. And this afternoon's protest outside the federal immigration court resulted in at least 2 arrests. But with thousands more expected to descend on the city for demonstrations, these arrests are likely just the beginning. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Usher Qureshi.
And now to Elizabeth Brackett and a look at some items on the NATO conference agenda. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Phil. NATO's future role in Afghanistan is at the top of the agenda for the leaders of the more than 60 countries who will gather in Chicago on Sunday and Monday. NATO's forces are scheduled to leave Afghanistan by 2014. How will that be accomplished? And what will NATO's mission in Afghanistan be going forward? questions that will be addressed in Chicago. Today, NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen laid out the priorities for the upcoming summit.
Today we have had a number of meetings in the North Atlantic Council to prepare the summit in Chicago, which is in just a few days. We discussed the capabilities NATO needs for the future and how to get them by doing more with what we have. This is smart defense. I look forward to a good strategic discussion with heads of state and government on Sunday. In Chicago, we will also discuss the future of our largest operation, Afghanistan.
Here to talk about all that are John Mearsheimer, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, Ahmed Rehab, Executive Director of the Chicago chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, and Dr. Zaher, President of the Syrian American Medical Society. Thanks to all of you for coming in. Well, we heard the Secretary General's priorities for the summit, but let's back up a minute and ask the question. The Cold War has been over for more than 20 years. Does NATO still need to exist? John Mearsheimer?
Well, I think that NATO serves two purposes. One, it continues to keep the peace in Europe. The mere presence of the mighty United States in Europe makes it almost impossible for anyone to fight in Europe. And the reason we've extended NATO eastward is to create a zone of peace that's even further to the east than it was in the Cold War. That's mission number one. Mission number two is that we like NATO, we Americans like NATO, because we're addicted to war. We've been fighting wars for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended, and we have this imperial impulse. And if you're going to fight imperial wars all the time, you need allies. So the Europeans not only help us by keeping the peace in Europe, they help us by serving us in our imperial missions. And Afghanistan is a perfect example of that.
Ahmed Rehab, do you think that's the mission of NATO?
Well, you know, when NATO started, it was a military pact to defend the West against the threat of the Soviet Union. Without that threat today, the question beckons itself, why is NATO there? And from my perspective, for the United States at least, NATO serves a great way to sugarcoat certain military expeditions that would be otherwise controversial should they run under the gamut or the brand of the United States alone. Being NATO, you know, an alliance of various nations that include the UK, Germany, France, Turkey, etc., it makes those expeditions much more palatable.
What's your thought on that?
Well, some members of the Syrian American community in Chicago are organizing a demonstration to support NATO's mission in Libya and asking for more proactive role of NATO in Syria. Definitely NATO is relevant to the people of Libya. Definitely it's relevant to the people of Syria and the new democracy in the Middle East. For the first time in my life, I've seen posters in Syria raised by demonstrators asking for no-fly zone by NATO. So it is relevant to the new democracies which are popping up in the Middle East, and I think its role may be changing in the 21st century.
One of the things they say they're going to vote on is the Connected Forces Initiative. They're going to be asked to approve this, and that, they say, is the allies working together in the most effective way possible. Now, the Connected Forces Initiative, does that seem something that would be relevant, say, to what you would like to see NATO doing?
What the Syrian people have been asking, and I'm talking here as a Syrian American, is more proactive role for NATO in terms of creating buffer zone so the population of Syria can get better organized. Because for the past 14 months there has been slaughtering to the Syrian people by the regime. And there is an imbalance of power. And there is a need to have this imbalance of power shifted. And having NATO in support of the Syrian population will reshift this balance of power.
Well, let's talk about what Syria's role should be, what NATO's role should be in Syria. John Mearsheimer?
Well, I think the United States should stay out of Syria.
The United States or NATO? Or both?
The United States and NATO should both stay out of Syria. And I think we should not have gone into Libya as well. I think the United States should go into countries in the Arab and Islamic world only when there is evidence of genocide or a mass murder. Otherwise, we should stay out. And there are two reasons for that. First of all, I believe in self-determination. I believe it's up to the people of Syria and the people of Libya to figure out what kind of political system they want to have. And it's not really any of the United States' business. I know that's a very unusual attitude in the United States today. And then the second reason is I think it's very unhealthy for the United States, both economically and politically, and in terms of civil liberties, for us to be fighting wars all the time. I think it's about time we started ramping back all these wars and concentrated more on fixing problems in America and stopping worrying about problems in places like Syria and Libya.
Let's stick with Syria for a minute. Ahmed, Rehab, should NATO... You say no, you say yes. You said they should only go in if there's evidence of genocide. Let me skip to you a minute. Is there evidence of genocide in Syria?
There's definitely evidence of war crimes. So far, according to a United Nations estimate, more than 12,000 Syrian civilians have been killed. There's tens of thousands who are detained. There's 1 million internally displaced persons inside Syria.
You were just in Syria, right? And you went back to your hometown?
I came in from a trip to Jordan and Turkey, checking on the Syrian refugees. And there is a lot of suffering among the refugees. I mean, I've seen families who've lost everything. I've seen one family whose the husband told me that 2 of his sons were killed in the city of Homs. One of them was 13 years old. After he was injured, he was taken to a hospital which was shelled by the regime, and he was killed inside the hospital. So the whole family fled to Damascus, where they stayed for a few months. Then they ran out of money. Then they went to Jordan. And while they were crossing the border, they were shot at by the security, the Syrian security. So the wife and the daughter have been injured and in the hospital. And this is one of tens of thousands of stories like that. So there is a lot of suffering, and unless the international community and NATO and United States step up, then that will continue, and the whole area will be unstable. So there is an advantage for more proactive role for NATO and for United States in the Middle East to rectify the situation.
Ahmed, Rehab, these are similar stories to what we heard about Libya. There was NATO action in Libya. Why not Syria?
Well, you know, I sit in the middle literally and figuratively when it comes to this issue, and that is because I agree that there is great demand for intervention and for help, any help that the Syrians can get. The situation is very dire, as Dr. Sahloul just mentioned, except I don't trust NATO to be the one to do it. Because NATO is not
NATO,
well, it's
who else would be capable of doing it?
It's not a humanitarian aid initiative. NATO does things out of what it perceives to be self-interest. And I don't think that they see any self-interest in going out to help the Syrians. They don't have the oil that the Libyans had, or the oil that the Kuwaitis or the Iraqis had. And so to me, the question beckons, why would NATO want to invest money? It's hundreds of millions of dollars in the red. It's a very uneasy alliance. And right now they're dealing with Afghanistan. I don't really see a way for them to involve themselves militarily in Syria.
There's no question that there's terrible suffering in Syria, and I don't want to make light of that for 1 second. But there's suffering of that sort in countries all over the world. And the question we have to ask ourselves here in the United States is, do we want to take it upon ourselves to be the world policeman and go into those places and end the suffering, or at least try to end the suffering? I mean, you could take the same logic that you used for Syria and apply it to Iraq and say that we therefore made the right decision to go into Iraq in 2003. I think it was a huge mistake to go into Iraq. I think what we should do is not fight wars of that sort unless it's absolutely necessary, which again means when genocide or mass murder is taking place.
Dr. Sahloul, when you look at what happened in Iraq, and Afghanistan for that matter, where NATO forces obviously intervened, the United States obviously intervened, and you see the results, what does that make you think about the possibilities of what intervention could do for Syria?
I mean, I'm looking also at the intervention in Libya, and to me and to many people who are Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, that was a successful intervention, and we may disagree on this. But this is an intervention which led to the protection of the Libyan population, to overthrowing of a brutal dictator, and the people of Syria deserve similar intervention. We're asking here NATO to intervene to protect the human rights, which is, I think, one of the goals of the NATO, and also to promote democracy, which is one of the goals of NATO, and also to maintain stability in the Middle East, because what's happening in Syria will not stay in Syria. It's already started to affect Lebanon and Turkey and Iraq in the future, and these are important countries to us and to the stability of the whole Middle East.
Let me just briefly say, Human Rights Watch came out with a report on NATO's intervention in Syria, and they said the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, has failed to acknowledge dozens of civilian casualties from airstrikes during its 2011 Libya campaign and has not investigated possible unlawful attacks. That's what Human Rights Watch said about what happened in Libya. Now, yesterday there was an official response from NATO, and this response read, NATO conducted the campaign for Libya with unprecedented care and precision and to a standard exceeding that required by international humanitarian law. The mission was fully consistent with the United Nations mandate and saved countless lives. Since you're in the middle, Ahmed, Rehab, is that a sufficient response from NATO?
No, it isn't. It's not even factual. I don't believe that the intervention of NATO in Libya was actually per the dictates of the resolution from the United Nations, which talked about no-fly zone. However, NATO took that further into a sort of all-out war against Gaddafi, which ended well for the Libyans, God knows at what price in the future, but still, I don't think it's accurate to suggest that it was per the mandate of the United Nations resolution.
All right. Let's leave those intractable problems and move to Afghanistan. They've said that the top priority at the summit here is going to be NATO's future in Afghanistan. 2 years ago in Lisbon, they agreed that they would remove NATO troops by 2014. So how are they doing on meeting that goal, and what do you think they have to come up with at this summit to make that happen?
Well, there's no question that they're going to get almost all of the ground troops out by 2014. The United States, though, will leave special forces teams in that country for the foreseeable future. We will not abandon Afghanistan completely. The problem that we face is that once we're gone, the Taliban is going to end up controlling a large swath of the country. And it's going to appear to many people, quite correctly, like we lost the war in Afghanistan, even if we are able to prop up the Karzai government. So what's going on now is NATO is trying to come up with a story that it can sell to the American people and sell to the international community that says we've done a good job up to now, we're going to continue to do a good job, and when we finally leave, everything will be okay. But the fact is that's not true.
What do you think NATO has to do about their future in Afghanistan?
They're going to talk about shifting the current situation to where basically the 300,000 Afghani troops are in the forefront in terms of the security situation in Afghanistan.
And do you think that would be possible? Will that work?
I think that would be possible. It would be with the backing of the NATO forces for the next couple of years. And then beyond that is going to be a much bigger question mark, and I don't think they're going to arrive at any clear resolution in this summit. What you can expect to hear are a lot of general statements about almost every issue but cyber attacks and the importance of fighting terrorism. Particularly in Afghanistan, is going to be quite general in the formal communique that has to be a consensus document at the end of the summit.
What do you think will come out of that consensus document at the end of the summit? Will it be meaningful?
I'm not a specialist of Afghanistan, but what I believe in that NATO leaving Afghanistan without negotiating political solution that incorporate also elements of the Taliban would be very dangerous. So I think there should be a political solution or with negotiation with elements of the Taliban with the consensus of Pakistan and India before a NATO troop can leave Afghanistan.
And finally, the last thing they're talking about is that what they need to do now is start talking about smart defense. This is what the new role for NATO. I shudder to ask, but what does that mean to you?
Well, it's very simple. The fact is that the Europeans are broke and the Americans are broke. But most importantly, the Europeans are broke. So they can't spend any money on defense, any more money. We were talking about Libya before. The fact is that the NATO forces, the European forces, did not have enough military equipment and supplies to do Libya. And the United States had to come in and do all sorts of things that we had expected the Europeans to do.
You know, I'm going to have to cut you off right there at the end because we are out of time. But I want to thank you all very much. My thanks to John Mearsheimer, Ahmed Rehab, and Zaher. And to watch NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen outline the goals of the NATO summit, you can visit our website. Up next, NATO's effect on Chicago's business, so don't go away.